welcome and thank you so much for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today to discuss the Horn of Africa Crises Watch 2021. And we are thrilled to have today's guest speaking with us from Nairobi, Murithi Mutiga, Project Director for the Horn of Africa at the International Crises Group. Murithi, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
My name is Amanda Jolly, VP of Programs with the Council, and today's structure will kick off with a conversation with Murithi Mutiga and Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. We're absolutely honored to have Murithi here joining us from Nairobi to discuss the central question as we look ahead in the coming months of 2021, what critical crises, movements, and trends might lie ahead in the Horn of Africa. And for today's event, we want to say a huge thank you to today's event co-sponsor, the Trinity College Center for Urban and Global Studies. Their support made today's conversation possible, and we're thrilled to have their partnership. I want to say an extra special thank you to CTWAC board member Garth Myers. So thank you so much for all of your support and partnership. So with that, I want to get us started. I am pleased to turn it over to Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Murithi, for being here. There is a lot to talk about today, and I know our audience is anxious to get to it, so I'm just going to jump in. Today, we're going to be talking about the Horn of Africa. So this piece of geography that's defined by the countries of Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, and Somaliland. Did I get that complete?
Yes, you did.
Perfect. So, Murithi, I want you to sort of set the background for us. There are within this geographic region of the Horn of Africa several destabilizing threats. Can you outline, a few of the contributing factors that have contributed to where we are today?
Yes, thanks for having me and welcome to everyone. I would say that unfortunately, even by the standards of the continent, this is a particularly unstable part of Africa. The largest number of peacekeepers for many years. When you look at many metrics before the Middle East crisis, the highest number of refugees and internally displaced. There are a number of theories that people propound when they look at this. I think one of them is the question of the lack of a stable hegemon. When you look across the map of the continent, in the south, you have South Africa, which is a very powerful country, much larger in terms of its economy than its neighbors, and able to essentially ensure there's a sense of coherence among the various countries within that part of the world. When you look west, Nigeria is the giant of West Africa. Its economy is several orders of magnitude larger than that of its neighbors. And therefore, then it is able to export a degree of stability within that region. And of course, in the north, there's the old, although rivalrous, double hegemony of Egypt and Algeria. In the Horn, Ethiopia should be the natural hegemon. It's a country of 100 million people plus. It's by far the most powerful military within the region. But unfortunately, for various reasons, it had a very unstable 20th century. It had its numerous internal wars. When Ethiopia knows peace, in general, it is able to export a degree of stability within the region, but that absence of a strong hegemon doesn't help. This is also a part of the world where states are really very heavily contested. Citizenship, nationhood is a very contested concept. And it's no wonder that this part of Africa has witnessed 2 secessions in the last 3 decades. So this contested nature of the state, what's the right balance between the center and the regions? It has led to considerable conflict and has not contributed to stability. So I think those 2 factors are relevant when you look at why the Horn keeps making the headlines for the wrong reasons.
Well, let's talk about some of those headlines. At the Crisis Group, you focus on tracking ongoing and emerging crises and threats. Let's walk through the region, and if you could tell us from your perspective and from your work on the ground, what you believe are the top maybe 3 crises that are happening in the region.
The most pressing crisis, without question, is Ethiopia. This is a country, that is, as I said, very important to the region, one of the oldest states in the world, but now currently witnessing a very difficult, entrenched, and bloody conflict in its northernmost region, known as Tigray. We see that after the federal forces launched an assault on Tigray in response to an attack by the Tigray regional government on military installations there, we've had now a prolonged stalemated conflict that is really, as I said, very costly and that needs to be resolved quite quickly if Ethiopia is to move forward in a sustainable fashion. Secondly, just today, Crisis Group issued a paper about the crisis in Somalia. Somalia was due to hold elections before the 8th of February, but the president's term expired before they could agree on how to hold the election. This is a country, of course, that has been stricken by conflict for decades, but which has seen a modicum of stability, at least in parts of the country, and especially in Mogadishu over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, now a lot of that progress seems to be being undone by the political crisis, which has tipped into violence. We see the opposition there has taken a stand against efforts to extend the term of the president. We've seen the Somali National Army essentially splitting, and that is obviously something that needs to be addressed quite quickly. The third one, I would say, is the transition in Sudan. Like Ethiopia, it's going through a fairly fragile transition. Its economy is in dire straits. It really needs substantial support. But at the same time, Sudan and Ethiopia have their forces ranged against each other in a tense standoff in their shared border. So unfortunately, quite a lot to chew on. And yes, a lot of crises that really do need urgent resolution.
Thank you so much. So let's take each of those situations and look at them a little bit more in depth. And let's start with Ethiopia. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the root causes are, where we stand today, and if there are any sort of obvious or maybe less obvious paths to resolution.
So in Ethiopia, one of the things to note is that apart from the crisis in Tigray, the country is due to hold an election in the next couple of weeks, in less than 2 months, first week of June. But there's a fundamental absence of consensus among the elite. I think the way a sustainable path forward for Ethiopia is that its elites need to concede that you can't have a path forward in which you bring along the whole country without consensus, without trying to engage in a degree of comprehensive dialogue that brings together all political actors. Under current circumstances, we fear that the election will settle very little. Key opposition leaders are in jail. There is a bitter contestation about about how to potentially restructure the constitution in future, bitter contestation about what the right balance of power is between the center and the regions. I would say that finding a way to have national dialogue, and maybe if Prime Minister Abiy, who came to power with a lot of hope on his shoulders, who promised an opening, I think one of the lessons from history is that Ethiopia has suffered recurrent bouts of conflict, partly because there's never been an attempt to fashion a negotiated compact. If you look at the imperial states collapse, if you look at the military dictatorships demise in the late 80s and early 90s, and also the end of the Tigray People's Liberation Front's time in power, it was because they did not try to negotiate a compact. So I would say in Ethiopia, absolutely before or after the election, Prime Minister Abiy needs to change course, try and engage his rivals, and try and engage in dialogue that tries to bring everybody along in a way that is more sustainable than what we've seen in the past.
Staying on Ethiopia for a second, can you tell us a little bit about the humanitarian situation on the ground, especially in the Tigray region?
So Tigray is a region of only 6 million. It is one that was already quite food insecure. It was unfortunate that the crisis broke out right, in the middle of harvest season. There were already other crises that accompanied it, once in a generation locust, invasion, serious flooding also within the region. And now you have layered on top of that this very difficult and dangerous conflict. According to Ethiopia's own authorities, up to 4.5 million people at the start of the year needed food aid, which is a very considerable amount in a region with such a small population. So we've seen the humanitarian picture improve somewhat over the last couple of weeks. The authorities have allowed more aid to flow through. The authorities themselves have supplied some aid. But the challenge here is that access is very difficult. This is a place with an ongoing conflict. It is a place with diverse actors. So you have the Eritrean troops, you have troops from an adjoining region called Amhara, you have the Tigray Defense Forces, and you have the federal troops. So access is very uneven. It has improved over the last couple of weeks, but I think one thing that bears pressing is that the planting season is coming up when the rains begin in June and July, and it's essential, at least by that point, that parties negotiate access, negotiate agreement, at least for farmers to till their land, and also ideally agree a cessation of hostilities.
Do you think that's likely to happen?
Unfortunately, I have to be the pessimist and say no. This is almost an existential conflict. It is one where the authorities in Addis Ababa blame the Tigray People's Liberation Front for not accepting that they had lost power and therefore engaging in destabilizing activities. The Tigray People's Liberation Front in turn accuses Addis Ababa of lacking the grace to accept that the TPLF gave up power relatively peacefully. And then you have the Eritrean element, which is a very old enemy. The administration in Asmara, the capital, has dwelled with the TPLF for years, and they fought a very bitter border war. So unfortunately, this is one where all sides pursue victory on the battlefield, but I think by most assessments, most people don't expect either party to be able to achieve that. So ultimately, most conflicts end in negotiations. I think to spare their people the suffering that will come from a long conflict, it is best that they negotiate earlier rather than later.
So let's do this. Let's go back and take a look at Somalia and Sudan. And then I know we have some questions from the audience sort of about the international response in the region as a whole. So tell us about, the situation in Somalia, the root of the crisis and where we are today.
So unknown to many, Somalia has actually fashioned a culture over the last decade and a half where they had regular elections, regular transfers of power, and therefore there was a very positive culture of consensus building among the elite. Unfortunately, a lot of that has gone out of the window over the last couple of years. President Mohamed Abdullah Farmajo came to power with a lot of hope. He classed himself a nationalist. He did achieve a few things, but I think there was an erosion of trust between him and other Somali elites, particularly those in charge of the various regions within the country called federal member states. That lack of trust then bled into this process of the election where Somalia was due to hold elections, as I said, towards the end of last year. But all parties accused each other of lacking good faith. And in particular, the opposition perceived Farmajo as looking to hold on to power by any means. In Somalia, no president in recent elections has been re-elected. There is an informal culture of power sharing, and therefore the stakes going into the election became very high, and resultantly, trust broke down and they could not agree on how to hold the election. Now, and what we see now is a resurrection of the old fissures of clan that always lay just beneath the surface. We've seen the Somali National Army splintering along the clan lines, depending on which side the opposition or the president is on. We've seen the opposition take many parts of the city and expel the Somali National Army. But today we did see some positive developments developments where even President Farmajo's allies came out and called for an election rather than a term extension. So there is a glimmer of hope that Somalia may go back to its old culture of bargaining and trading and consensus building, and that they could hold an election soon.
So on to Sudan.
Yes, so just on Sudan, very briefly, I would say the key thing to watch there is the economy. We did see in April 2019 a very inspired, united, a thrilling, peaceful protest movement succeed in ousting the long-ruling autocrat Omar al-Bashir. But what came next is a very uneasy coalition between the civilians and the military. So today, unfortunately, the key thing they're grappling with is an economy that is in very, very deep trouble. Inflation is almost treble what it was by the time Bashir was toppled. There's great hardship, serious electricity shortages. People cannot afford supplies, but then the supplies are often absent. There is some hope because, including with US support, Sudan has settled some of its sovereign debt. It might be able to borrow again, but I think this is a transition worth investing in, and let's hope that the economy can turn a corner, but also the long shot hope that they can hold an election soon, and that you maybe have a civilian-dominated cabinet.
Excellent. Murithi, so much to talk about here. I have an audience question that brings us just slightly outside the Horn of Africa. And last week, the president of Chad, President Deby, who had been president for over 3 decades, over 30 years, was killed sort of in the front lines. I think the circumstances around his killing are still a little bit murky. Can you talk about that in whether or not you think that the killing of the president in neighboring Chad might have impacts for the Horn of Africa?
It's a good question. This was a stunning development without question. Deby was a mercurial character who was often to be found marching to the front lines and fighting alongside his soldiers against the myriad rebels that tried to topple him. So yes, you're right. We're still poring over the exact circumstances of his death, but it would not be too surprising if in fact it turned out that he was killed in combat at the front. The neighborhood will be watching with anxiety, without doubt. This was a reasonably stable country that fancied itself an exporter of peacekeepers. It sent troops to Mali, which has been battling a long campaign against Islamist insurgents. It sent troops to battle the jihadi group of Boko Haram that has menaced northern Nigeria and its neighborhood for quite a long time. And Sudan also will be watching with a lot of care, partly because Deby, sponsored a group of rebels that were active in the Darfur region that, was stricken by conflict for a long time. So people will watch this with anxiety. I would say, though, that there's a broader lesson for the international community and for the region. I think Deby had a lot of friends outside Chad, partly because he positioned himself as a ruler that could guarantee stability. But the lesson we see now in the turmoil in N'Djamena, the capital, and Chad more widely, is that when you govern a country without accountability, they had considerable oil wealth. This wealth was not widely shared. You do not have sustainable peace. And so I think the lesson to be drawn is that there's a balance to be struck between the desire for stability, but also making sure you have accountable government.
So, Murithi, looking at the region, are there any situations we missed? Is there anything going under the radar that we may be hearing about in a few months, or any other issues that we should be paying attention to?
Yes, so very briefly, I would say that there's the transboundary water dispute between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan about the Nile, sharing the Nile waters. This is one to watch. Ethiopia is building a very large dam upstream. It says that it needs that to power its development. It also rejects colonial era treaties that unfairly allocated all the water to downstream countries. But then, of course, Sudan and Egypt are anxious about the project. I think cultivating consensus on this is very important, partly because one of the problems that has bedeviled this region is the question of proxy wars. When tensions rise between various actors, there's often a temptation to sponsor various proxies. And so Ethiopia is due to fill the dam, do the second filling of the dam in July. I think Ethiopia certainly will not back down on that, but it's essential that all parties find a way to cooperate, to share information, and therefore to lower the volume. I would say the economic crisis that might spring from the long COVID crisis we've seen in the region, that's one to watch. We are seeing countries that were not really ready for the economic stresses of shut down economies, of declining tourism, in some places declining remittances. There will be a long tail in terms of the crisis that springs from that economic challenge. So that's one to watch. And then I would say that the fragile peace deal in South Sudan is another that needs careful nurturing because it stopped the bleeding, but then the elites there can also not agree on a way forward.
Excellent. I want to bring in a question from Paul, and it's a question about, you said earlier that sort of Ethiopia would be the natural hegemon in the region, and he wants to know, is hegemon, even if locally, really the best and only option to stability? Is there another alternative? Is there, is regional collaboration possible? What kind of other support might lead to more peaceful, stable outcomes in the Horn of Africa?
It's an excellent point for sure. I would say that when you look at the Horn of Africa, one of the issues that really, one of the points in which the region struggles to cohere is the absence of effective multilateralism. Compare with West Africa. They have the economic bloc ECOWAS. It tends to be very active. It is funded largely by member contributions, and so they feel a real ownership of it. And ECOWAS has intervened quite a few times to try and bring stability in its neighborhood, including in the past in Liberia and more recently in Gambia. That is missing in the Horn. I agree entirely. What I would say though is that Ethiopia in the past was at the vanguard of efforts to promote multilateralism. And so Ethiopia cultivated very close ties with Nairobi. Addis was also very in close ties with Khartoum. It promoted a degree of stability in Somalia. Now we've had a sudden change of leadership within the region. Unfortunately, that has left the multilateral institutions, especially the regional bloc IGAD, in a very weak position. So I agree, stimulating greater cooperation, building trust between the new leaders, particularly in Addis and Khartoum, and trying to revive IGAD. That might be a step in the right direction, and it's one worth investing in. But first, you really have to calm the tensions between Ethiopia and Sudan, because otherwise, without that, IGAD will struggle even to survive.
So there's a lot of questions about international actors, and let's start with a question about beyond peacekeepers. Do you think there is a role that the United Nations could play in the stability of the region?
Yes, so the United Nations historically has actually contributed a fair bit. It has hosted refugees. It has hosted peace talks. I would say that in the current moment, special envoys from the UN particularly could play a useful role in just passing back channel communications and promoting lines of communication between the various actors that are having strained ties. So you have strained ties between Nairobi and Mogadishu, you have strained ties between Mogadishu and Djibouti, but also, as I said, between Khartoum and Addis. So that's a role that special envoys could play. I would say that in a place like Somalia, where the UN is such a heavy contributor alongside the African Union in its security, in its development, in relief supply, perhaps they could take a more direct role and a mediation role. So, for example, at the moment, it's very hard to see, bridging the divide between the actors. So maybe external mediation led by the African Union, but backed up by the UN might be useful in calming the waters in Somalia.
And since we're coming to you from the US, inevitably there's going to be a question about the role of the United States. So we know that just over the last 20 years, the United States installed an AFRICOM, and we know that there is a naval base in Djibouti. Do you see a regional role for the United States?
I think it's heartening that the Biden administration just in the last few days appointed a special envoy for the Horn, Jeff Feltman. I would say that stimulating again discussions between the various actors. For example, on the Nile dispute, that could be useful in helping to calm the waters, helping Ethiopia navigate its very difficult upcoming election period, and very quickly, perhaps also engaging with the Gulf actors that are important players within the Horn and ensuring that they do not export their rivalry to a region that's already quite fragile in a way that is not helpful. I think that in that way, the US could contribute.
And so since we're all aware that we're entering this period of great power competition, we often look at the world in terms of the United States and China in the race for power. What role is China playing in the region today, and do you see that growing?
Chinese influence in the region has expanded just exponentially over the last decade and a half. You've seen extraordinary investments in the various economies. You've seen its first external military base in Djibouti. You've seen a cultural push for them to come in with their television stations, Confucius language institutes. I would say that in a place like the Horn of Africa and more broadly on the continent, the more actors there are, the better. All of them come in with various specialties. The Chinese spotted a huge gap in terms of infrastructure, and they invested very heavily. I think elites within the region, though, have to be judicious in terms of the way they manage those relationships, because some of them have taken debts that are unsustainable and that have become very unpopular because they're crowding out other public services in terms of servicing the debt. So I would say that it's useful to have more actors within the region. The US is a very important partner for many years, but I wouldn't say that there's been too much harm in having the Chinese also coming in with their own different set of approaches. And so, yes, we will continue to see big power competition, but I would say it would not be helpful to have a rubric where people have to choose. I think there's room for everybody to coexist.
Excellent, thank you. And just as we end, let's look at the sort of, the most important on the ground perspective. What can regional leaders, what can leaders on the continent do to contribute to, the stability of the region? And what do you think is the best hope forward?
Yes, regional leaders already play a very important role. In Somalia, for example, the African Union mission there has sent a very large contingent of troops that has paid a very high price, including in pushing Al-Shabaab out of the capital. The African Union has increasingly taken a position where it wants to take the lead in mediation efforts alongside regional blocs on the continent. So I think this is a trend that needs to be encouraged, but also it is one that we have to be careful about because the various powers within the continent will not be engaging just purely out of altruism. There will be a lot of self-interest. And so, in the various conflicts and settings, I think it's very important for the African Union Commission and its chair to just be careful who it is that is taking part, but the very concept of African-led mediation should be welcomed.
Murithi, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's after hours in Nairobi, but we are so grateful that you were able to join us, and I look forward to talking to you again. Just quickly, how can people follow you if they wanted to learn more about what you're doing and your work?
Yes, so my Twitter handle is @MutigaM, so just my second name, Mutiga M. And then I also publish regularly on the Crisis Group website. So that's crisisgroup.org. So those are two good ways to do this. And I'm very glad, I could join. Thanks to everyone for participating.
Murithi, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And it's such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. I also want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. As you may know, today's conversation was recorded and it'll be published on the Council's YouTube channel at World Affairs Council of Connecticut. And in addition, we'd like to invite you to subscribe to the State of the World podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And so this episode will be live on Monday. So if you subscribe now, you can get notifications when this event is posted and check out all future events and the previous episodes as well. I also want to say a huge thank you to our co-sponsor of today's event, Trinity College Center for Urban and Global Studies. Thank you once again for making this possible and for all your support. So once again, thank you so much, Murithi. It was an absolute honor to host you. And this was an excellent briefing on what's happening right now and what's ahead in the Horn of Africa. So thank you everyone for joining us, and until next time.